Welcome to the debate. Today we are tackling really one of the most fraught decisions anyone faces. When does hopeful persistence in a relationship, become denial? The material we looked at offers a powerful diagnostic framework, but it also exposes, I think, a deep conflict over how we measure success and failure in love. So the question is, should the decision to stay or leave be primarily driven by objective, research-validated behavioral indicators, the hard facts, or should it be ruled more by subjective internal assessments of personal well-being and relational resilience? I'll be arguing that clarity and, frankly, protection from further harm demand we anchor this monumental choice in those clear-cut, quantifiable, predictive signals.
Okay. But I think focusing solely on external metrics like that kind of misses the point of relational life itself. While, sure, objective tools provide essential diagnostics, they help us understand what is broken, they really cannot, and I believe should not, override the necessary inclusion of subjective experience. And crucially, the mutual intent to actually engage in repair. That human element, the willingness. That's got to be the final variable in this equation.
Well, my position really rests on predictive accuracy. I think the clearest path to clarity involves rigorously applying these established high-accuracy behavioral criteria. Specifically, we have to look at Gottman's research, which identifies the four horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. These destructive behaviors, they aren't just signs of stress. The data shows they are predictors of divorce with over 90% accuracy. That's incredibly high. So if these patterns are persistent and, systemic, the relationship is fundamentally toxic, regardless of subjective feelings of attachment or hope. The framework, I believe, must rely on the objective difference between solvable problems, like, remember Amy and Tom's surface-level conflicts over housework? They fix that with checklists and fundamental incompatibility. Think of Mike and Jennifer's financial values clash. Security first versus enjoy life now.
That distinction, based on core value conflict, it's objectively defined and it's critical. We rely on these objective criteria specifically to prevent that emotional trap research confirms leads to, quote, wasted decades, not eventual happiness, which is, of course, the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, and that trap, the sunk cost fallacy, it is potent, no doubt. We stay not because the present is good, but because we're afraid of wasting that past investment. But I still believe the ultimate decision has to rest on subjective, internal factors, the state of one's own well-being, and that mutual intention to fix the damage. Look, relationship problems, even severe ones, are often situational, right? Driven by stress, parenting issues, maybe career shifts. They're not always characterological flaws. Take the example of Karen and Steve in the material. They were essentially just roommates, not really partners, because of all these external pressures. And the key signal for their decision to stay wasn't the absence of problems, far from it, but their immediate and mutual willingness to solve them once they actually recognize the distance between them. And, furthermore, the highest metric for a healthy relationship has to be its subjective impact on the individual.
The research cited Harvard, Princeton, Stanford indicates healthy relationships must increase well-being, inspire growth, bring out one's better self. So if a person finds they are consistently less happy, less confident, less yourself, the research actually indicates leaving. Now, that assessment is inherently subjective data, drawn purely from internal experience. And the ability to repair after conflict, that sincere apology, the act of forgiveness, that's the true measure of relational resilience. And that requires internal, subjective effort and connection, really rooted in a solid friendship foundation.
I absolutely appreciate the emphasis on resilience, but we have to return to the core of what actually destroys that resilience, those predictive markers. If contempt, which is fundamentally communicating disgust and superiority to your partner, Gottman calls it sulfuric acid for love. If that is persistently present, why should we focus on subjective willingness? The evidence strongly suggests that persistent, high-accuracy toxic behavior means the relationship is, dying. Willingness to try, however sincere, simply cannot overcome sulfuric acid. We have to prioritize an objective decision to leave before that contempt causes irreparable long-term psychological damage.
Okay, while I completely agree contempt is lethal, absolutely it must be addressed. I think the presence of the horseman should perhaps be seen more as a diagnosis, not necessarily an automatic death sentence. I guess I look at it differently. The horsemen prevent problems from getting solved, precisely because they destroy respect. So the critical question isn't just whether the symptoms exist, but whether the couple has the underlying foundation that friendship, love, and respect, and, crucially, the mutual determination to acquire the communication tools needed to stop the toxic behaviors. I mean, consider stonewalling. It's often a physiological response, particularly in men, where they get so emotionally overwhelmed they literally just shut down. Now that's toxic, yes, absolutely, but it's often a learned defensive behavior. If both partners are willing to work on regulating that overwhelm, creating safety for each other, stonewalling can often change. If both people are genuinely willing to engage in the work, then the horsemen are symptoms you can potentially treat, not necessarily the final verdict. And, this leads to another critical nuance in the data we looked at. The source identifies that a huge chunk, 69%, of conflicts in a long-term relationship are actually perpetual. They're intrinsically related to fixed personality traits, not specific behaviors that you can just solve. And successful long-term couples, the Yale research confirms, don't solve these deep, persistent conflicts. They learn to manage them. So if management, not resolution, is the goal for nearly 2/3 of all conflict, isn't the subjective capacity to manage that, ability to tolerate and accept those differences without developing, that crushing, silent resentment, isn't that more important than the initial objective incompatibility?
That's a compelling point regarding personality traits, but I would argue it sort of misses the distinction between perpetual conflicts that can be managed and fundamental incompatibility that frankly cannot. Perpetual conflicts that are manageable are things like, one partner being messy and the other being neat. You can agree to disagree, find a system, manage it. But facing fundamental incompatibility, like the irreconcilable differences in financial values for Mike and Jennifer, that's entirely different. Their disagreement wasn't just about budgeting styles. It was about core life philosophy, risk tolerance, future planning, how money relates to happiness itself. For Jennifer, any compromise felt like losing her entire worldview of enjoy life now, while for Mike, deviating from security first felt physically anxiety-inducing. So when conflicts strike that deeply at your identity and core goals, compromise starts to feel like losing yourself.
And that, I believe, objectively guarantees deep, toxic resentment that no amount of subjective tolerance or willingness can truly overcome. The relationship was inherently unsustainable because the conflict wasn't just behavioral, it was existential. Now, let's look at how the decision framework actually guides action. The structure laid out is mostly objective, right? Identify the issue, check for the horsemen, assess willingness, and critically set a definitive timeline. Relying on objective data and setting that definitive timeline, like let's try therapy rigorously for 3 months, offers tangible accountability. It protects against the emotional confusion inherent in a subjective crisis. So why then does the source conclude by emphasizing trust your gut, citing Columbia research? It feels like undermining the necessary rigor we just established. The gut, it's prone to fear. It's prone to fantasy.
See, I'm just not convinced that relying solely on the calendar is the solution. Because the subjective well-being piece, that feels like the final, essential data point. If we're talking about a monumental life choice like this, the data gathered from your own nervous system, from your own internal state, is often the most relevant piece of information you have. The research shows people often know the relationship is over, or maybe should be over, long before they consciously articulate it. The objective steps, they diagnose the potential for repair, sure, but the subjective step, the well-being check, the gut check, that's necessary to determine if the cost of trying to fix the problem is simply too high for the individual. I mean, think about the emotional toll of setting that 3-month timer you mentioned. If pursuing repair, even if it's objectively successful repair by some metric, leaves you consistently anxious, physically drained, and less confident, then the relationship is still fundamentally failing the primary test, which is increasing personal health and well-being. And furthermore, this internal barometer is absolutely essential for immediate safety. The material states unequivocally that abuse or persistent infidelity requires leaving. Now, while objective data eventually confirms these issues, the first most relevant signal is often that profound, subjective feeling of diminished safety. That internal distress, the gut reaction that just screams, "I must protect myself," often comes way before external data can fully confirm the necessity to leave. So, the subjective gut check doesn't replace the diagnosis, it determines the threshold for pain tolerance during the attempted cure, if there is one.
Okay, but the intellectual rigor required for this monumental life decision, I still maintain, demands adherence to predictive objective data. If we prioritize identifying those non-solvable core value conflicts and the relentless persistence of the four horsemen, we gain the necessary clarity to avoid prolonged misery. If the metrics gathered during, say, a 3-month structured observation period clearly show the foundation is rotten, then staying is simply falling victim to that emotional trap of the sunk cost fallacy. Objective facts, I believe, offer the clearest map out of emotional quicksand.
But the map is useless if you're too exhausted or diminished to actually walk the path, right? The decision framework is most effective, I think, when those objective diagnostics, that clear list of symptoms, are filtered through essential subjective metrics. The mutual willingness of both partners to change, the enduring integrity of the friendship foundation beneath it all, and, above everything else, the protection of personal well-being. Focusing only on symptoms risks ignoring the capacity for intentional, internal repair that defines resilient relationships, like Karen and Steve's, which recovered precisely because they found that mutual willingness when they were faced with the hard truth.
Ultimately, I think the material confirms that true clarity in this decision requires understanding both the observable science of relationship dynamics, the hard data that predicts collapse,
And acknowledging the complex internal reality of love, commitment, and, maybe most importantly, the absolute necessity of protecting your own personal health and integrity through it all.